What is the price of a single mistake? Not your mistake. Someone else's. For Sarah Jenkins, the price was her name, her reputation, her family, and 4,382 days of her life. 12 years. This isn't just a story about a wrongful arrest, a case of mistaken identity. It's a story about the crushing, impersonal weight of a system that demands a conviction and the devastating, personal war one woman had to wage from inside a concrete cell just to get her own life back. This is a story about a fight for justice that lasted over a decade, a fight that began with the sudden, violent shattering of a normal morning and ended with a truth the world was forced, finally, to hear. Before that Tuesday, her life was defined by a rhythm so beautifully ordinary it was invisible. It was the 6 a.m. alarm, the smell of coffee brewing, the mental checklist of school lunches and permission slips. It was the hurried kiss for her husband, Mark, as he left for his construction job, the chaos of getting her 7-year-old son, Ben, and her 10-year-old daughter, Emily, onto the school bus. Her job as a part-time bookkeeper at a local dental office was a sea of predictable numbers. Her life was a tapestry woven from these small, reliable threads: carpools, grocery lists, PTA meetings, and quiet evenings watching sitcoms. It was a life built on the simple, unspoken contract we all sign with society. Follow the rules, work hard, love your family, and you'll be safe. That contract was torn to shreds at 6:15 a.m. on a cold October morning. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a slam, a percussive, authoritative boom that shook the whole house. Mark was already gone to his site. Sarah, still in her bathrobe, ran downstairs, her heart hammering with the thought that something had happened to him. She opened the door to see 4 men in dark jackets, their breath pluming in the cold air. They didn't ask, they told. They were police, and they had a warrant for her arrest. The words made no sense, a jumble of syllables that her brain couldn't assemble. Armed robbery, assault, positive identification. Her kitchen, moments ago smelling of toast, was suddenly filled with the scent of wet wool and the metallic click of a radio. The children woke to the sound of strangers' voices in their house. Emily stood frozen on the stairs, her eyes wide with terror. Ben started to cry. Sarah tried to speak, to explain, to ask what was happening, but her words were cut off. You have the right to remain silent. She tried to tell them she was at Dr. Patel's dental office all day on the date in question, the day of the robbery. She was running payroll. They could check. One of the detectives, a man with tired eyes, just nodded slowly, as if she were reciting a script he'd heard 1,000 times before. She was told to get dressed. She was not allowed to hug her children goodbye. She was walked out of her home, past the peering curtains of her neighbors, and placed into the back of a police car. The cold vinyl of the seat, the smell of stale cigarettes, the suffocating finality of the door slamming shut. In that moment, her old life ended, and her new one, a life of unimaginable horror, began. The crime she was accused of was brutal and senseless. A local convenience store had been robbed at gunpoint 3 weeks prior. The elderly clerk had been pistol-whipped, his cheekbone shattered. The community was outraged, and the police were under immense pressure to make an arrest. The only evidence was a shaky, grainy surveillance video showing a person in a hooded sweatshirt, and the terrified, confused testimony of the clerk, who, days later, had picked Sarah's photo from a lineup. He had seen her picture in a local paper weeks earlier, in a small human interest story about a charity bake sale. This detail, this contamination of memory, was never explored. The police had their suspect. The narrative was simple, and it was clean. The next 48 hours were a descent into a bureaucratic hell. She was processed, fingerprinted, and photographed. The flash of the camera felt like a small explosion, stealing a piece of her. She was given a phone call. She called Mark, her voice cracking as she tried to explain the impossible. He was frantic, confused, promising to get a lawyer to fix this. But they couldn't afford a high-powered attorney. They were a 1.5 income family with a mortgage and car payments. They were exactly the kind of people for whom the justice system is an impassable mountain. She was assigned a public defender, an earnest but exhausted young man named Mr. Harris, who seemed to be juggling 24 other cases just as desperate as hers. The trial was a masterclass in failure. It was a cascade of confirmation bias, procedural errors, and a devastating lack of resources. The prosecution presented its case with chilling confidence. They had the witness. The elderly clerk, his hand trembling, pointed at her from the stand. "That's her," he said, his voice paper-thin. "I'll never forget her eyes." The prosecution argued that her part-time bookkeeping was the perfect cover, that she was desperate for money, though they offered no evidence of this. They painted a picture of a cold, calculating woman, a monster hiding in plain sight. Her defense was tragically weak. Mr. Harris tried. He presented her alibi, the timesheets from the dental office. But the prosecution dismantled it, suggesting she could have easily slipped out during her lunch break, as the robbery took only 15 minutes. Dr. Patel, her boss, testified she was there, but on cross-examination, he admitted he hadn't physically watched her every single minute of that day. He couldn't. Who could? The jury, looking for certainty, saw only doubt. The one piece of evidence that could have saved her, the grainy surveillance tape, was presented as inconclusive. Her defender argued you couldn't tell who it was. The prosecutor argued that it didn't exclude her. The most critical failure was the photo lineup. It was later found to be fatally flawed, a classic suggestive lineup where Sarah's photo was subtly different from the others. But Mr. Harris, overworked and inexperienced, failed to challenge its admissibility. When the jury forewoman read the verdict, the word guilty didn't register at first. It was just a sound, disconnected from reality. Sarah looked at Mark, his face crumbling. She looked at the jury, their faces averted, refusing to meet her gaze. And then the sound hit her, a rushing in her ears as the judge's voice droned on about sentencing guidelines. 20 years. 20 years for a crime she didn't commit, for a day she had spent organizing spreadsheets. The gavel fell like an axe, severing the last thread of hope. She was cuffed and led from the courtroom, a ghost walking through the ruins of her own life. The first year in prison was not about survival. It was about the management of despair. It was a fog of shock, a daily, grinding abrasion of her identity. She was no longer Sarah. She was inmate 774, A9. She was stripped of her name, her clothes, her dignity. The smells, industrial bleach, stale sweat, and simmering fear. The sounds, the echoing slam of metal on metal, the disembodied shouting, the buzz of the fluorescent lights that were never turned off. The psychological torture of her innocence was a separate, heavier sentence. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the clerk's face, the jury's turned backs. She saw her children's faces, confused and weeping, as she was led from her home. The visits were the cruelest kind of torture. Mark would bring the kids, driving 4 hours every other Sunday. They would sit across from her, speaking through a crackling telephone receiver, their hands pressed against the thick, smudged plexiglass. She watched her daughter, Emily, once bubbly and bright, become quiet and withdrawn. She watched her son, Ben, too young to understand, simply cry for his mom to come home. She had to lie to them, to tell them Mommy had made a mistake but was trying to fix it. The truth was too complex, too terrifying. These 20-minute visits were the only thing she lived for, and they shattered her anew every single time. She would return to her cell, a tiny concrete box, and collapse, the sobs racking her body until there was nothing left but a hollow ache. After the first appeal was denied, a predictable, procedural rejection, something inside her shifted. The grief, the despair, it didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It hardened from a paralyzing fog into a cold, sharp diamond of rage. It was the anger of the innocent, the most potent fuel in the universe. She realized, in a moment of terrible clarity, that no one was coming to save her. Mr. Harris was gone, assigned to other, newer tragedies. Mark was drowning in debt, trying to be two parents at once. The system that had failed her had already forgotten her. If she was going to reclaim her life, she would have to do it herself, from a 6x8 cell. Her new battlefield was the prison library. It was a small, damp room with outdated law books, their pages brittle and yellowed. She, who had only ever balanced ledgers, began to study the law. She learned a new language: habeas corpus, post-conviction relief, ineffective assistance of counsel, Brady violation. She spent every available minute reading, taking meticulous notes on yellow legal pads. She became a jailhouse lawyer, a figure both respected and pitted by other inmates. She dissected her own case, reading the trial transcripts until the pages were soft with wear. She read them over and over, searching for the one crack, the one mistake, the one thread she could pull. She found it. A single line in a police report she had never seen before, a report that had not been turned over to her defender. It mentioned that a witness, a teenager at the bus stop near the convenience store, had seen a man running from the scene. A man, not a woman. This witness was never called. This report was never disclosed. It was a clear Brady violation, the prosecution's legal and ethical requirement to turn over all exculpatory evidence. This was it. This was the key. She began to write. She wrote hundreds of letters, her hand cramping, her fingers stained with ink. She wrote to Innocence projects, to legal aid clinics, to university law professors, to investigative journalists. Her letters were not rambling pleas for help. They were meticulous, carefully argued legal briefs, citing case law and pointing directly to the undisclosed police report. 4 years, the replies were a cascade of rejection. We do not have the resources. Your case does not meet our criteria. We regret to inform you. Each no was a fresh wound. Mark, on the outside, grew weary. The fight was costing them everything. The house was foreclosed. He and the kids had to move into a tiny apartment. His belief in her never wavered, but his belief in the system was long dead. After 7 years of writing, 7 years of no, one letter landed on the desk of a young, tenacious lawyer at a small, university-funded Innocence project. His name was David Chun. He was intrigued not by her plea, but by her argument. It was clear, logical, and legally sound. He requested the case files. What he found shocked him. It wasn't just the suppressed police report. He found that the original photo lineup, which had been presented in court as a standard procedure, was a mess. Sarah's photo was the only one with a white background. The others were gray. She was the only one not smiling. It was a neon sign pointing directly at her. David Chun and his team of law students began a new investigation. This was not a retrial. It was a full-scale excavation of a buried truth. They found the teenager from the bus stop, now a grown man, who confirmed his original story. He saw a man, not a woman, fleeing the store. They dug deeper into the physical evidence. At the original trial, the prosecution had downplayed the grainy video. But technology had advanced in 12 years. David's team sent the original tape to a digital forensics lab. With new enhancement software, they were able to isolate a few frames. The person in the video, while still obscured, had a height and build that was demonstrably different from Sarah's. But the real breakthrough came from an old, forgotten evidence box. Inside was a blue baseball cap, the one the robber had dropped while fleeing. In the original investigation, it had been dismissed because it had no testable trace evidence. But now, new DNA technology allowed for touch DNA to be extracted from the sweatband. The Innocence Project filed a motion to have the cap tested. The district attorney's office fought them, tooth and nail. They filed motions to block the test, arguing that the chain of custody was broken, that the case was closed, that it was a waste of resources. They were not just resisting, they were actively protecting their original conviction. It took another full year of legal battles just to get the simple DNA test approved. The results came back on a Thursday. The DNA on the cap did not match Sarah Jenkins. It did, however, match a known serial armed robber who was currently serving a life sentence in another state, a man who had committed a string of similar robberies in the same time period. The case was not just flawed, it was a catastrophic failure. The state's case, the one that had cost Sarah 12 years of her life, evaporated. The exoneration hearing was not a celebration. It was a stark, sterile legal procedure. Sarah was brought into the courtroom, not in a prison jumpsuit, but in a simple dress Mark had brought for her. She was thinner, her face etched with lines that hadn't been there 12 years ago. Her children, now young adults, sat in the front row. Emily was 19, Ben was 17. They were strangers to her, and she to them. The district attorney, a different man from the one who had prosecuted her, stood and read a brief, passionless statement, agreeing to vacate the conviction in the interest of justice. The judge banged his gavel. "Miss Jenkins," he said, "you are free to go." The words free to go were as surreal as the word guilty had been. The courtroom doors opened. She walked out, not as inmate 774, A9, but as Sarah Jenkins. She stepped into the sunlight, and it felt too bright, a physical assault on her senses. The air was different. The sounds of traffic, the smell of exhaust, the feeling of the wind, it was all overwhelming. She hugged her children, a strange, awkward, and desperate embrace, trying to bridge a 12-year gap in a single moment. She was free, but she was not whole. Life on the outside was its own kind of prison. The world had moved on. The internet was everywhere. Cell phones were now small, flat computers. She suffered from severe PTSD, flinching at loud noises, hoarding food in her bedroom, waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, convinced she was still in her cell. Her relationship with her children was a painful process of reintroduction. They loved her, but they were the children of a father who had done his best, not the mother she had been. Mark had waited for her, his loyalty absolute, but their marriage was also a casualty, a bond forged in trauma that they now had to rebuild from the ashes. But the anger, the cold, sharp diamond that had saved her was still there. She had won her life back, but the system that had taken it was unchanged. Sarah Jenkins, the quiet bookkeeper, was gone. In her place was an advocate, a warrior. She began to speak. She spoke to law schools, to state legislatures, to journalism students. She told her story, not for sympathy, but for change. She campaigned for mandatory recording of all police interrogations, for better funding for public defenders, and for reforms to witness identification procedures. Her fight was no longer for herself. It was for the person she had been, and for the countless others still trapped in the cells she had left behind, writing letters no one was reading. Her 12-year nightmare had ended, but her life's work had just begun.